Good morning, everybody, and good morning, everyone who's on the webcast. You know, it's a testament to the power of Twitter that it gets free advertising from Strobe Talbot. I want to thank Strobe. I want to thank him because he has led this institution spectacularly for the last 10 years. It's America's premier think tank, and it's that way because of Strobe's leadership, because of his exceptional team. This idea of independence, rigor, and quality. This morning he said, you know, facts are important. He said it in a much more eloquent way, but he said, facts are important. Facts are important because they're the things that guide discourse, they're the things that shape conversation, they're the things that are the basis of any real decision. And we're sitting in a house of facts. We're sitting in what is America's premier think tank, and not that rankings matter, but in fact it was externally validated with some little survey by somebody or other recently. Wouldn't it be nice to be validated by a survey that you're the best at anything? But that's a tribute to Strobe's leadership and vision, and I have to say that it's an honor to be here. One of the things I've done at Ford in my time there is just come back to this house, just build our relationship to an even stronger place. And we've done that not because we have an inherent love of Brookings, it's because we have an inherent love of the facts and ideas that an institution like this generates on behalf of all of us. Now, about today. You know, I'm going to talk about this a little personally for a minute. I was born 50 years ago, just this year, at a time when this country was doing something that these days seems almost unimaginable. It was declaring a war on poverty. Or, the way I think of it, it was declaring a war on behalf of the poor. Lyndon Johnson, who we sometimes forget, cared about these issues so deeply, said, "It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it." That was, you know, he was the President of the United States. Those words were coming out of the most powerful man in this world. You know, what came next were real things. Real things. Head Start, Job Corps, Vista, and a slew of other tangible, material, real programs. And we know that it was transformational. You know, people forget that it was transformational. In 1964, at the beginning of that war, in 1964, 19% of the country found itself living in poverty. 19%. 1 out of every 5 Americans. By the end of the decade, 6 years later, 72 months later, that rate had dropped to 12%. 12%, less than 2/3. The war was successful. 1 out of every 3, more than 1 out of every 3 people who'd been living in poverty 72 months earlier was no longer living in poverty. Now, for me, and maybe others in this room, those initiatives were more than just statistics, more than just ideas, more than just intangible notions that affected other people. As a boy growing up in the South Bronx, I was raised by a mother who made $50 a week, sometimes less. We lived in a tenement surrounded by what were then the most dangerous streets in the country. For me, and likely some of you in this room, the war on poverty offered the hope of a better life and created opportunity for the kind of limitless lives so many of us here now lead. I know I'm not alone. I want everyone in the room to just step back and think about how your life was changed by the war on poverty. Maybe it was like for me, food on your plate, but maybe it was about just living in a more just society. Just step back and think about that. 1/3 of your neighbors who had been living in poverty, no longer living in poverty. They might not have been your neighbors next door, They were your neighbors spiritually. Now, for many of us, the trajectory of our lives was changed by that war. The trajectory of our lives was changed by that reality. We are in this room because the President of the United States spoke of that war on poverty, that war for the poor. And let me just also say, as we kick off this day, because I want us to ground the conversation this day on this idea of poverty and what it means. Let me just also say that it gives me great pride that many of those original anti-poverty programs were backed by the Ford Foundation. And I say this not immodestly, because this all happened well before I was there. It's what reminds me of my responsibility day to day to make sure that institution, the institution I run, is as strong and powerful as it can be. Those programs, initiatives like the Gray Areas program in Boston, Oakland, and Washington, Bobby Kennedy's work in Bed-Stuy, the CDC, the idea of the CDC and its work. Those programs were all based on collaborations like the collaboration you're going to hear about today, work with the Ford Foundation and places like the Brookings Institution, places that cared about this issue, that cared about this war, that created the intellectual groundwork for that future, those programs, those ideas that changed lives. But if you think about today, back to Twitter and Facebook and names like Zuckerberg, Tumblr, and everything else we've just grown accustomed to. If you think about today, we know that the deep-rooted inequities, the war on poverty attempted to end, are still with us. And they're more complicated. They're more complicated because the geography of poverty has fundamentally changed in a way that makes it harder to deal with. The majority, and you heard Strobe say this, you know this, you've seen this. If you've lived in San Francisco, you notice the dearth of poor people. If you go to the Richmond, just across the bay, you notice the concentration of poor people. If you live in Manhattan, you see the dearth of poor people. If you go to the parts of Brooklyn that don't have mass transit and those old inner suburbs just beyond the city's borders, you see the concentration of poverty. Today, suburban communities like Seat Pleasant in Maryland, Edgewater in Colorado, Mount Vernon, of all places, in New York, are home to many of America's poor. People living there face many of the same challenges many of us living in places like the South Bronx faced 50 years ago. American suburbs, the aspirational place, the place you dreamt of going. If you drove a cab, you saved your dollars to buy that house, have today become home to the same cycles of poverty that trapped people in the infamous bleak urban ghettos of the 1960s and 70s. A child growing up today in one of those poorest suburbs, one of those poorest zip codes, faces many of the same challenges a child growing up in the South Bronx did in the 1960s. You have to transpose the neighborhood that poor person lives in. You have to bring yourself into a new reality. You have to imagine not the housing project, but that suburban home that was once someone's dream. Now, there's a difference. Absolutely, 50 years ago, we lived in substandard housing and went to underperforming schools. We had a dearth of good jobs. We had all the things we understand neighborhoods of poverty have vast crime problems. But the concentration of people and the concentration of urban resources, things like transportation, cultural assets, the proximity between jobs and housing, even in the poorest neighborhoods, the proximity of community and family knitted together that community. And it kept many of us from sinking into even more deep poverty, even deeper poverty, the kind of isolated poverty that so often is the case in suburban communities. For poor suburban families, these challenges are very, very different. They, instead of being knitted to jobs by mass transit, instead of having the number 6 train linking the South Bronx to the Upper East Side, face long commutes, lack of reliable public transport, an absence of basic health and social services. There is no municipal hospital network in a small suburban town. All the basic supports that helped us survive, that in many ways were legacy assets of those very poor neighborhoods, are blank in these new suburban neighborhoods where poor people now live. That is the new reality. That is the new reality of people living in places no better off, but without community as a safety net, without legacy assets contributing to their lives, without transport connecting them to opportunity. And that's why in 2010, the Ford Foundation committed $200 million to a new Metropolitan Opportunity Initiative. You know, we didn't announce it on the radio and on television. We just went about and started the work. It's a new effort. It's a new effort to support innovators who are reaching beyond the borders of individual neighborhoods to connect people to opportunities in their wider metropolitan region, asking, how do we get the deep poverty of the Richmond and San Francisco connected to the immense wealth and job creation engine that is the corridor between the city of San Francisco and Palo Alto, where so many of these companies we're all joking about this morning exist, and where so many of them actually face labor shortages. It's through that work, by the way, that we're proud to partner so closely with the Metropolitan Policy Program here at Brookings. They have been an intellectual engine and force for that work, for that investment we're making all over the country. Their work, including the book by Alan and Elizabeth that you'll hear about today, is helping policymakers and the public move outside of these outdated perceptions of what poverty really means and where poverty lives to the new reality, this new reality of suburban poverty. Their work reminds us that poor people, like so many others, are drawn to regional employment opportunities. They participate in metropolitan labor markets, search for homes on a regional basis, and work in industries and services that are within close geographic proximity, but often just beyond their reach. That's why it's so critical to think of access to opportunity not as an urban or suburban opportunity, not as this idea that Detroit is dying while Ann Arbor, just 45 minutes away, is thriving, but as a challenge that affects the entire metropolitan area, that both Ann Arbor and Detroit benefit from the kind of linkage that Ann Arbor needs to fill its jobs and Detroit needs to feed its people. Only by accepting this new geography of poverty can we define solutions that address this problem holistically, that address the immense inequity of having our poorest people live just beyond our sight, not on our subways, not in our museums, not in our parks, just beyond our sight, inaccessible to us as we are inaccessible to them. It means addressing issues like suburban affordable housing, access to mass transit, streamlining and simplifying the processes by which states and counties provide a range of benefits to families. Now, all of these ideas are highlighted in Alan and Elizabeth's book. And I'm just proud to say that throughout that book, laced throughout it, are our grantees. People like the Transit-Oriented Affordable Development Fund, the Metropolitan Planning Council of Chicago, the Urban Institute's Work Support Strategies Initiative. By the way, the Urban Institute, another fantastic partner of ours. These innovative leaders and countless others, our grantees, our partners all over the country, are not only advancing creative solutions to both entrenched and emerging problems, they're giving us models for what an effective and modern effort to expand opportunity looks like. But it begins with an understanding of where those challenges are. And I'm hopeful that today's event will help us be grounded in this idea. This idea that today's poverty is no less urgent than the poverty President Johnson declared war on. That today's poverty is no less painful to the people suffering it than it was to those of us suffering it 50 years ago. But that it looks different, and that in many ways it's a harder poverty. That isolated poverty is a kind of hopeless poverty that we have to begin to address, in particular because it's less visible to us. In particular, because it's more isolated from us. In particular, because we won't run into it on the subway or in the park. We'll drive past it on highways. Anyway, as President Johnson said 5 days ago, this is about 50 years ago. You know, that's spoken like someone who just has been in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington twice, and New York since last Monday. I think in my prior life I was an airplane pilot, and now I'm penalized by having to be a passenger for the rest of my existence. But you know, President Johnson said we can't afford to lose this fight. I think when he said that, he meant the responsibility we have for the poor. I think of it differently. I think we can't afford to lose this fight because our spirits shouldn't allow it. We can't afford to lose this fight because we need to wake up every morning and understand that the benefits we have, the joy we have, the safety and security we have, has to be grounded in the idea that there are people out there who don't have that safety and security, and that it's not right that we benefit from the joy of enough when others so profoundly suffer the want of too little. So with that, let me introduce Elizabeth Kneebone. Elizabeth is a fellow of the Metropolitan Policy Program here at Brookings, focusing on poverty, this idea of metropolitan demographics, tax policies that support low-income workers and communities. In other words, Elizabeth does all the work we do at the Ford Foundation. She's the co-author of this, Confronting Suburban Poverty. It's the groundbreaking book we're going to discuss today, but she's also helping us think through what we do next. Thank you, Elizabeth. Come on up.